Data is the new oil. Your company may already have a lot of data stored in your databases. So how do you refine and use that data? This is where Azure Data Factory comes into play because it helps you to process that data and increase its value. That's what a factory does. In this course, I want to show you how Microsoft ADF works and how to use it. I'll show you how to understand the basic and the more advanced object model of ADF and how to transform your data with it. Let me let you know what kind of knowledge you should bring into this course to complete it successfully. First, you should have basic knowledge on how to use Azure on the Azure Fundamentals level, also known as AZ900. By the way, there are also courses about that available on LinkedIn Learning. So you should know the basic infrastructure of Azure, what is an Azure subscription, what is an Azure resource group, etc. And the next thing is that you should have a taste for playing around with data. And that's about it. So let's go. Before we can dive into ADF, of course, it's necessary to create an instance of ADF in your Azure subscription. I will show you how to do that using the Azure portal. First thing to do is taking a look at the Azure Marketplace and search for Factory, and then you will find ADF as Data Factory by Microsoft for simplifying ETL at scale. This is what we are supposed to do. And then you pick and choose the appropriate Azure subscription. Luckily, you have decent permissions on that. And maybe you already prepared a decent resource group. If you didn't, then you can just hit the create button and create one of those. In this case, it's rg-my first ADF. And the instance itself is supposed to be named like ADF123. But wait a minute, it looks like the name of that instance needs to be globally unique. And that's why I have to attach some more numbers to make sure that this instance is globally unique. I'm fine with East US as a region, and I'm also fine with version 2 because it's the one and only right now. A couple of months ago, we had a coexisting situation between version 1 and version 2, but luckily version 1 is gone, and that's why we don't have to deal with the differences here. So now let's take a look at some other tabs on this Azure Blade for the ADF configuration, like the Git configuration. I don't want to configure Git right now because I'm not into CI/CD right now. I want to focus on how to use ADF, so let's configure that later. It's pretty much the same with networking here. I want to stay with the default. I will use the public endpoint because I don't want to ingest the ADF instance into an existing Azure Virtual Network or something. I will just stay with the default. It's pretty much the same with the Data Factory encryption. I don't want to relate my ADF instance with an Azure Key Vault or something. I will just leave that blank. I'm not going to use tagging because I don't need it right now. And let's just review the deployment configuration here. Let's read the terms if you want that, and then you just hit the create button, and after a couple of seconds, your instance of ADF will be up and running. Let's go to the resource, and here we are. And now let's take a closer look at what we can do here on this ADF instance. Before we dive into ADF, let's take a closer look at the instance that is now deployed successfully using the Azure Resource Manager object model. We have this instance, which can't be renamed as a matter of fact, but it can be moved from one resource group to another one or moved to another subscription if you want that. Here we have the activity log that is used to log down all the write operations on your ADF instance. So not the read operations, only the write operations. And here we have the access control panel, which is supposed to be used for configuring role-based access control, for min role configuration or least privilege configuration if you want that. And let's take a look at the roles that can be assigned on the scope on an ADF instance. Of course, you have the default built-in roles like owner, contributor, and reader that is compatible to pretty much every layer of deployment on Azure, like the subscription layer, the management group layer, the resource group layer, or the service instance layer like ADF in this case. But we have also a special role that is dedicated to ADF. It's called the Data Factory Contributor. You can see it here. It's supposed to be used to create and manage data factories as well as child resources with them. So let's take a look at what you can do with this particular role. You can see that only one array is actually used. It's, in this case, the actions array. And here you can see, based on resource providers, what you can do with this particular role. In this case, it's creating and managing ADF and child resources with them. Tagging is pretty obvious. I don't need it right now. So let me click on the next button. It's the diagnosis button, which will be very useful a little later on this course when it comes to troubleshooting. Here we have the networking configuration. We've already seen that on the deployment blade, which can be used to inject this service instance into a private network using a private endpoint if you want that. Here we have the managed identity configuration, which is set on by default. That means we have an object principal ID within your Azure Active Directory tenant that can be used for assigning roles to that particular instance, for getting one step closer to what's called zero trust security configuration. Here we have the read-only view on the properties on that particular instance. And if you want to protect your ADF instance from being accidentally deleted or changed, you can use a lock to prevent that from happening. And the rest is pretty self-explaining for now, and I will dive deeper on monitoring and troubleshooting in another video. So next up is about to take a closer look at the ADF Studio. So now let's get an overview on the key functionality of this ADF user interface. So here we have some hyperlinks helping us with ingesting some data and orchestrating code-free data pipelines. That's nice. And also to transform some data. But wait a minute, if you think of that, and maybe you are a little longer in IT, since 10 years, maybe since 20 years, maybe from the on-premises world, you still remember a pretty similar product that is coming from Microsoft. It's called SSIS, also known as SQL Server Integration Services, which is supposed to run on premises. In the end of the day, Data Factory is pretty similar to SSIS. Of course, it's not the same, but it's quite similar, and that's why it's compatible in certain situations. So we can also configure SSIS related to ADF if we want that. Next up, let's click the author button, or let's try to hit the new button, and you see that we have a decent object model here in ADF that is not so self-explaining. So in the next couple of minutes, we will dive a little deeper on what's a pipeline, what's a data set, what's a data flow, etc., to make sure to understand the object model of ADF. So here we have the monitor on ADF. We will dive deeper on that later, getting some extra insights on triggering information or debug information when it comes to troubleshooting your pipelines on ADF. Here we have the management portal, and on this management portal, you can get some information about some things that are called integration runtimes and linked services, some other entities on ADF that are not self-explaining. So in a couple of minutes, we will define what this is and what we can do with that. And of course, depending on your need of information or the kind of learning type you are, maybe you like text-based documentations, maybe you like videos. it really makes sense to dive a little deeper on the Learning Center to get some extra information on how to use ADF. If you want to use Azure Data Factory, you need to know basically 4 different object types on ADF. It's dataset, linked service, activity, and pipeline. In this video, we want to dive a little deeper on what's a dataset and what's a linked service. So in the end of the day, you need datasets to represent the entities of your data that are input or output in your pipeline. Like, this is the storage account ABC. I want to read in some data from it. Or this is the Amazon S3 storage account that is supposed to be used to output some data according to my pipeline. It's just a logical representation of it. And if you want to read or write this particular data as part of your pipeline, of course, you need permissions on it. You need authorization, and ADF needs to know where to find that data based on a connection string. And that's pretty much what a linked service is all about. It's a connection string that is used to build up a connection for read and write operations, also known as CRUD operations, to your data sets. And now let's dive into the portal and click a little demo. Let me show you what I have prepared for this little demonstration. Here I have an Azure storage account. And inside the container service of that storage account, I do have a container which is called Data Factory. And in this container, I have 2 virtual folders. It's called input and output. Let's take a look at the input folder. Here we find a CSV file, and let me give you a little preview on that. And here we have some CSV based data in that particular file. And now let me give you the output folder. Here we have another CSV file. Let's hit the edit button. You can see that it's empty. And of course, and obviously, we want to now come up with a copy data pipeline solution to connect those 2 CSV files using datasets and using linked services. Now let me show you the easiest possible way to come up with a simple copy solution from a storage account container to the next. So the easiest way to do that is simply to hit the ingest button. And the ingest button is gonna start a wizard that is gonna support you to set up a built-in copy task to run it for once, or maybe on a schedule. Run it once is good for me. And here I have the source type panel, and this source type panel is gonna create a data set. And this data set is pretty much like one certain type of a data source or a data destination. Could be cloud-based, could be on-premises, as long as it's supporting representational state transfer or any sort of OLEDB or ODBC driver if you want that. And here we have the actual connection string that needs to be created for, in this case, an Azure Blob storage. Let's just give it a name, and let's specify the default integration runtime that is hosted in the cloud and that is using some compute infrastructure to actually perform this integration job for running the ETL procedure here. And when it comes to authorization, we can choose between an Azure Storage Account Key or a SAS in this case. An SAS is a shared access signature, so it's pretty much like a connection string on steroids that also supports conditional access control and everything. And you can also use a service principal, which is recommended to production infrastructure when it comes to implementing zero trust security architecture. So using the account key is pretty much quick and dirty. If you want that, it's good enough just to perform this integration operation in a non-production scenario. So just pick and choose the subscription and the decent storage account here and click on the test button. And after the test was successful, you can hit create, and the data set and the linked service is gonna be created by the wizard. So let's configure the source data store. Here we have, in this case, our connection to my source type, which looks good. And now let me browse through my container service here, and let me choose the input folder, and this is my CSV file with the data already in it. So this is pretty much like my data source, and I want to read some binary data here from this file, and I want to do it recursively. Maybe it makes sense in this particular demo situation. Let's hit next, and now let's configure the destination for my ETL pipeline here. Now let's dive into my blob storage account again. Let me browse to my container, and now let me hit the output folder, and here I have my empty CSV file, which is supposed to be my data destination for this integration solution. So the rest looks fine to me. Let's hit next. And now I have a task name already specified by the wizard. Let me just leave it like it is. Let's hit next. And now I have the summary on the screen summarizing all the important information about my ETL solution here. Here I have the properties of my task. Here I have the data source, the data destination, properties, and the copy settings. And if you like everything you see, you just hit next, and the wizard will take care of the rest. And what's happening in the background right now is that all the necessary entities for this solution are created in the background. And now let's dive a little deeper on the details. So you can see that creating the data set was successful, and we have two data sets, one data set for the data source and one data set for the data destination, that are running based on the connection string, also known as a linked service. And here we have created a pipeline, and this pipeline was actually performing only one action, which is pretty much like the minimum amount. So let's dive into that job that has been completed successfully. You can see it right here. And now we kind of understand what a pipeline is. So a pipeline is an orchestrated procedure with at least one action. Okay, so here we have this one and only action, which is called copy data. So now we are back in the storage account, and now let's dive into the container. Here we have the data factory container and the output folder, and here we have the output CSV file. Let's hit edit, and you can see that all the data have been copied from A to B. Looks good. So now that we saw how to integrate two different CSV files using ADF, it's time to review the configuration from another perspective. So let's click on the author pane, and here we have the pipeline that is running my one and only copy action here. Could be more, but not less. As I told you, at least one activity is necessary. Here we have those two data sets representing the data source and data destination, all based on an Azure blob storage account using one connection string called the linked service. The linked service cannot be found here, but instead you can click on the manage button, and here you can see the linked service on the connections panel. And now, since this first solution was successful, I want to clean up a little bit simply by deleting this linked service for now. I'm sure, yes, I want to delete that, but seems like I can't, because it's still in use. It's still related to two different data sets, and seems like I have to delete them first. I want to show you this because I want to let you know that we have dependencies on those different object types here. So now let me delete the data sets. Looks good to me. And now let me delete the pipeline. Looks good as well. And let's give it a second shot and try and remove the linked service again. But I'm still not successful simply because the deletion of the pipelines and data sets needs to be published. So let me publish the deletion of pipelines and data sets. And now let's give it a final shot. Let me try and delete the linked service. And now it's gone. When you do have a data source like this CSV file, for instance, maybe you want to process that data by transforming it. Maybe you want to work with those data and make changes when you write the data from A to B. So let me show you how to do this with ADF. So what we need for doing that is a new object type, which is called a data flow. You can create a new data flow here on the ADF UI directly on the home page if you want, or you can switch to the authoring panel and create a new data flow there, or you can go to the home area and click on the transform data wizard if you want that. And it's gonna create a new data flow directly for you. And now what we need to do is to specify one or more data sources. So let's create our first data source. And you can see it could be more of that. But let's start up with one data source based on, surprise, a data set. In this case, it's Azure Blob Storage again, and I want to read some data from a CSV file. So now I want to specify the appropriate linked service, and don't forget to set the first row as a header. And of course, we need to specify the appropriate CSV file. So here I've got my movies CSV, and let's hit OK. So this is my data source. Looks good. Okay, and next, let's hit the plus button on the canvas. And then you can see what options for data transformation you have using ADF. Like when you have several data sources, you can join it, you can use the union option, you can perform a lookup, or you can use the schema modifier to select data, pivot data, rank data, whatever you like. But let's keep it simple for our first data flow here and perform a simple filter operation on the data. So let's choose the filter option. And now we want to filter on certain attributes on the data we have ingested. So I want to filter on certain attributes using the expression builder because it's easier for me, because when I now click on the input schema, I see all the attributes that are available for filtering. So let's play around a little bit with the expression box here. Here you can see the logical parameters you can use, like logic or logic and, not, exclusive or, equal, null, inclusive, equal, etc. So just play around with that a little bit. And first, I want to filter on the year of that movie's release date. So let's start off with to integer. And now I want to read in the year of that movie. I'm just using the IntelliSense here. And in this case, it's supposed to be greater or equal to 1910. And now I want to combine that with movies that are younger or equal to the year 2000. And now I want to filter on the genre of that movie using the r-like method. And here I want to specify the string that is coming from the genre column. And the pattern is like comedy. So that looks good for me. And now let's try to get a preview on the data based on my expression. So here we are after a couple of seconds. And now let's watch the first column of that table. In the first line, we have a match because it's 1980 and it's a comedy. In the second and third line, we have a mismatch, and that's why it won't be a part of our official result here. So now for completing the data flow, let's specify a data destination. So let's scroll down a bit, and here we have the destination sync option. So let's choose that. And in this case, we want to write the data to a blob storage account again and a CSV. It's the same connection string. Use the first row as a header, and we want to use the one in the output container. Looks good to me. Let's hit OK. And now let's give this a try. Let's validate the whole procedure. No errors found. Now let's use the debug functionality. Let me just show you how this works, because it's based and running on top on the Azure-based integration runtime in this case, because it's delivering the horsepower we need for performing the debugging. So now we can take a look on what's happening here when we perform a refresh on the data preview. So depending on the complexity and the amount of data, we have to wait for a couple of seconds. And here we are with the result. So this is pretty good for debugging when it comes to verifying that the data arrive with the quality that is desired. So since everything looks good, let's validate the whole data flow. So looks good, and let me publish the changes on our two data sets and on the data flow. So now publishing was completed. Next thing we need is the component to orchestrate the data flow, because the data flow cannot orchestrate itself. All we can do is debugging it and get a preview of the data that goes in and that comes out of the appropriate action. So what do we do? Of course, we have the orchestration wizard, which does pretty much the same like creating a new pipeline. So let's create a new pipeline. And here in the area for move and transform, we can find the data flow action. So in the settings panel, we just pick and choose the data flow. In this case, it's data flow 1. And that's pretty much it. Let's validate. Looks good for now. We can still debug it. We can add a trigger if we want that. We can just trigger it now. So the pipeline was not found, obviously. Never forget to publish the changes. Looks good. So let's give it a second try. And let's take a look at the pipeline run. It's in progress. So here we are. It took more than 4 minutes for this operation to complete. And now let's take a look at the storage account to verify the results. So this is my blob storage container that is supposed to be the data sink. And here we have the actual file that has been created by the pipeline. Let's hit edit. And here we have all the comedies that were created between 1910 and the year 2000. In this video, we want to wrap our heads around triggers on ADF. So different ways of kicking a pipeline to start its activities. So let's go to the authors panel, and here I have a pipeline already available. And now I can open that pipeline if it's not opened already. And here I can find an option that is called Add Trigger. And now I wanna create a new trigger. And let's take a look at the options already existing for us to choose from. Of course, I have to give my trigger a name. In this case, it's trigger 1, which is fine for me. And here we have 4 different trigger types available. It's schedule, tumbling window, storage event, and custom event. What are the differences between those trigger types? Well, a schedule typed trigger is pretty much self-explaining because we have a time zone, we have a certain start date, and we have a certain recurrence like once a minute, which is pretty much like the minimum amount that is supported by the scheduler. If we choose to use a tumbling window, it looks pretty much the same on first sight, but it's different because it doesn't support a recurrence of 1 minute. It's going to expect at least 5 minutes, and it gives you an extra option of specifying dependencies between your triggers. So that means when you have different triggers, you can set up dependencies in terms of offset and window size between those triggers if you want that. Maybe you don't want to trigger your pipeline time-based, but event-based. If you want to do that, maybe it's a storage account involved, because when you have an event like a new blob was uploaded to a storage account, you can come up with a connection to an existing storage account and specify a blob event like a blob was created to use that as a trigger event. There is also an option called custom events, and a custom event is related to an Azure service that is called the Azure Event Grid. So if you create an instance of the Azure Event Grid on your Azure subscription, you can also listen to events like something happened in your IoT hub, something happened in your Azure Media Services account, something happened on your Azure Resource Group level, whatever you like. So it's pretty much like an if this then that configuration to integrate events with your ADF pipeline if you want that. But let's keep it simple here, because right now I just want to trigger my existing pipeline like once a minute. I need to publish that trigger in this case, and of course relate it to a pipeline. This is important to understand. So the trigger needs to be related to a pipeline and it needs to be published, and the publishing was completed. And now we can watch the operation to be completed on a regular basis. If you want to move some data from A to B or process some data, of course, you need some compute capabilities. And this is what an integration runtime does for you. Let's take a look at the documentation very briefly to see what runtime types are actually available. And we have 3 of those. It's called Azure, self-hosted, and Azure SSIS. So here we can see in that table whether or not it depends public network or private link. But the key question is, okay, when to use what? When do I use Azure-based integration runtime? When to use self-hosted integration runtime? When to use SSIS integration runtime? So let me give you a brief answer to that particular question. It depends on the actual question whether or not you want to use SSIS. If you want to do it, use it. If you don't, ask yourself a question. Do you want to self-host the integration runtime to keep the data private going in or going out or being processed? If this is the case, use the self-hosted version. And if it's not the case, or if you want to use a Microsoft data flow, which requires the Azure-based integration runtime, use the Azure-based integration runtime. It's that simple. Now that we're back on the ADF UI, let me show you where to find the configuration for integrated runtimes already existing. Here we have the default Azure hosted one called Auto Resolve Integration Runtime. Here you can take a look at the JSON-based declaration or metadata of this default integration runtime. You can also dive into the monitoring details, like let's see what's happening here in terms of activities, and you can see the pipeline and actual activities being performed by that integration runtime. So now let me show you how to create a new integration runtime. Here we have the SSIS option, and here we have the self-hosted option if you want that. And let's say I want to come up with a hybrid scenario. I want to read some data from the on-premises world. So it really makes sense to do that with a self-hosted integration runtime. So let's give this a name and hit create, and then getting a wizard and a description how to set up this integration runtime and connect it to my private environment, also known as my on-premises infrastructure. Therefore, I need to download and install some sources. Here is the appropriate hyperlink, and here I have the authentication key that has to be used to come up with the connection between Azure and my local system. When you're trying to learn ADF, maybe you already have some experience using Microsoft Excel. And let me tell you about a former Microsoft Excel plugin, which is called Microsoft Power Query, which is nowadays a part of Microsoft Power BI. So if you have some experience on that particular technology, you can use it on ADF simply by querying and transforming your data based on Power Query. So let's create a new query based on Power Query. Let's give it a name and specify a data set, maybe a new one, maybe one that is already existing. And then after a couple of seconds, Power Query is gonna appear on your screen. Let's make some space here. Not everything is supported here, so it really depends on what you're doing. But let's do something simple here, like filtering on some data using Power Query. I would just filter on the documentary movies here on my data. So here I have the applied step. And if I want to, I can also take a look at the advanced editor. And this is pretty much like my M-based function, which does pretty much the same what I'm doing here in my graphical user interface. So let me validate this Power Query. Everything looks good. Let me save and publish. And now what this Power Query does is filtering all the documentary movies from my dataset. So there's one more question: how to run this operation based on Power Query? Well, the answer is pretty simple. We do it with an orchestration, also known as a pipeline. And when you take a look at the actions, you will find the Power Query action. And all you have to do is going to the settings panel and pick and choose the correct Power Query query and specify a sink. In this case, I will specify my CSV-based connection, and now I want to validate the configuration to make sure of everything is fine. And now let's trigger it. But before we trigger it, we should publish the configuration of that pipeline. So now let's add a trigger. So everything looks good. And let's take a look at the pipeline run. And then we have to wait for a couple of seconds until this procedure was completed successfully. So here we are. Now let's take a look at the result. This is my blob storage container. Let's dive into the input folder. And here we have the new CSV file. Let's take a look at it with all the documentary movies. When it comes to data transformation, we already talked about the existence and the idea behind data flows. Let's repeat what this actually does. We have a data source and we have a data sink, and then we have plenty of potential transformation actions in between. And this is where the problem lies, because we need to find a solution to make all of this reusable. Let's think of some sort of container storing all this data flow logic right here and make it reusable as what's called a flowlet. And we can create a new flowlet right on the data flows level. We can also use optional folders to have a better structure when we have plenty of data flows and flowlets, by the way. And now when you create a new flowlet, you have to specify a data source, like some JavaScript object notation based on one of the existing data sets or linked services in this case. And then we have to specify an output, and then we can specify all the transformation items in between on that canvas. And now when you specify a data flow, as I said, you can simply use it as a data source and store all the business logic that is specified in that particular flowlet and make it reusable, which is much easier for management of more complex data flows by using flowlets. Before you think of using ADF for real in a production environment, it's always worth to take a look at the Azure subscription and service limits, quotas, and constraints. ADF is listed twice on the service list for some reason, maybe because it's so cool and so important, of course, and it's linked to the same section, just like we have it here. I won't go so much into the details, just take a look at it and compare it to your real-life requirements when it comes to running and using ADF in production mode. Congratulations! You did it and you completed this course about Azure Data Factory fundamentals. So you see, it's the most important part to wrap your head around the object model of ADF, and the rest is much easier when it comes to building up your own no-code ETL solution with ADF. When it comes to the next steps, let me give you a hint when it comes to pipeline templates. I really like those, so let's click on that. And here you have plenty of templates for ADF pipelines that are ready to use. You just have to click on it and create an instance. Like when you have other ideas on how to use ADF, just give it a try and make the best of it. You can do this. I'm Carsten Ulfertz. See you next time.